Hey, this is Writer's Row. I'm DC Wright-Hammer, and I brought on a special guest for this episode. I will let him introduce himself.
Hello, my name is Clarence Carter. I'm the author of No Honor Among Thieves, The Blacktop Kings, and my most recent collection of short stories, Shadows and Keyholes.
Yep. And I brought Clarence on to talk about the topic of short stories. I think a lot of independent authors, especially and just in general, there's a big market for short stories, anthologies of short stories, and so on. So I wanted to bring on Clarence. He's written some short stories and participated in anthologies. So I want to bring him on to talk about that. So first thing I'm going to open up with, what do we mean by short story? So let's clarify that for the audience first. So we've got novels, short stories, maybe even we talk about what a novella is, something like that. So can you give us a quick definition so we're level setting?
Sure. So, a short story, typically, the most marketable ones are between 3,500 words and about 7,000 words. And 5,000 is sort of the sweet spot. Most anthologies and magazines are aiming for that.
Got it. And so novellas are longer than that, and then novels, obviously, up to however long they need to be.
Right. So the generally anything beyond 40,000 words is considered a novel. So anything between 7 and 40 is a novella or a novelette.
Okay. So yeah, I have never written a short story that I've really done much with. I've written the beginning of longer stories and stopped writing them. But I'm used to having this giant, canvas to be able to work and to be able to do a lot of like, foreshadowing and different things like that. And, basically not being direct, not being linear in my storytelling. That doesn't sound like it would translate very well to writing a short story. So can you talk us through the creative process there?
Sure. So typically with short stories, you want one character arc or one emotional impact rather than, a novel where you kind of go up and down. Your characters have good days and bad days, and there's a lot of time for a lot of different smaller arcs. Where short stories, you really want to have just one sharp character arc, and usually it's tied around an emotion. So they start out one way and they sort of end with a different type of closure.
Yeah. And I've heard the quote, people might forget your story, but they will remember your characters. And that mostly applies, they'll remember the character's journey. Does that apply at all to short stories? I mean, you don't have a ton of, runway to actually develop your characters.
Right. Not generally. The characters are usually forgettable, but the emotional impact seems to be the big thing. They will remember that heroic act when they beat the villain or whatever.
Yeah. I will say, just kind of thinking generally now, I've read some Stephen King, short stories and things like that, and I think that's kind of, the characters in my mind are characters. They're like fleshed out. They're people.
Mhm.
But yeah, I'm thinking of like 1408, the hotel haunted hotel room, and I remember there was like children or something. I remember little bits and pieces. I remember being scared.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of brings to life the short story playing on an emotion, playing on something like that. So talk about the planning of a short story. Like as a I'm sort of in between planner, pantser,
Yeah.
planter, whatever they call it. Um, and I do like to when I get stuck, I got to go back to the planning phase just to kind of map out where I'm going to go next. How does
Mhm.
that look for writing short stories?
Well, I suppose you could plan a short story, but I'm a pantser through and through. So I just, right off the top of my head, everything for short stories for me is very situational. Like, I will become very fascinated by a certain thing, and I will then think about it for a long time and eventually translate it into a short story. So, for instance, are you familiar with the cryptids called Wendigo?
I am not, but that's okay.
Well, there's a mythical creature that eats people, and they're called Wendigo. And I wanted to write a short story about that for a very long time, and it just sort of went over in my head, for a long time, I just thought about it and thought about it and thought about it. And eventually I was like, I think I've got it. And then I wrote a short story that's in the collection, Shadows and Keyholes. It's called Wendigo Psychosis. And it's about a truck driver with his kids in the cab who gets stalled on the side of the road in a snowstorm. And there's something in the woods.
Yeah. And, you know, that sounds really cool. I've started probably 2 or 3 different novels, or what I thought would become novels, and I get stuck in some of the minutia. I get stuck in some of the character development, and in the back of my mind, I'm thinking, why don't I just focus on like basically the plot and just, you know, shorten everything, drop the reader in, and run with it. And is that sort of, you know, the mindset for a lot of short stories? Just drop them in, run through the plot, get it over with.
Yeah. So essentially, if you think about your story and you think, well, it's no matter what I do, it's going to be short. I don't know what happens after the villain and the protagonist face off. At a certain point, you're like, okay, this is probably a short story, unless you set out to write a short story and you can't stop the characters from interacting with each other, and then it becomes a novel.
Yeah, I could see that problem. I bet you I have that problem. When I started writing my first novel, Between Two Minds Awakening, I had a scene, just a scene in mind, and I started writing. That scene actually didn't even make it in the first book. It ended up being in the second book. But yeah, it started off as a scene, and then yeah, I couldn't stop writing. And so, you know, how important for short stories? So for me, I guess where I actually figured out, is this a novel, is it a short story, is I had someone else take a look at it, and, you know, kind of talk about the importance of having others look at your short stories the same way you might have someone look at a novel. Very
important. So with shorter fiction, I've found that you want each scene to be very crisp, very tight. You know, your sentence structure needs to be tight, because you're only allowed whatever that market wants, whatever that magazine or anthology or whatever. Let's say they want 5,000. Well, there's not usually a lot of wiggle room. So you want each sentence and each movement of your character to be very precise. And sometimes you'll have another writer or an editor or whatever look at it, and they're like, okay, well, you can cut here, 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 and then that wiggle room comes down, you know, and it's very important to have precise sentencing.
So word economy is super critical with short stories, which makes sense. And future plug, I have a video on word economy coming pretty soon, probably whenever it might have already come out. I don't know when I'm going to release this video, but that's okay. But word economy, it's a super cool concept for me, even in novels, when you do have this, you know, you can have some more longer prose, you can get a little fluffy in some places with words where it makes sense to the story, where it makes sense to the characters. So I guess going back to short stories, you know, how do you still have to get people to care about your characters, right? You have to get them to buy into whatever's happening, what's going on, assuming the story has characters. Now, I guess there's also genres where it's just a narrator telling us things, right? But how do you get people invested in your characters with such a short, you know, you don't have very much time, like you still, and you said they're forgettable. So like, how do you get them to like these props, basically, is what they end up being?
So there's a phrase that they use, especially in filmmaking, called save the cat. So if you can initially have your character do something minorly heroic, or, you know, very, what's the word I'm looking for? Like very positive, very reinforcing, you know, make your character likable in the beginning, have them do something lovable, hug somebody that they barely know or something. And then it sort of reinforces that your character is a good person, if that's what you're going for. Sure. Sometimes I like to write short stories about villains. So you kind of do the opposite. You make your character not likable.
And the payoff then is seeing them getting their comeuppance, or hoping you're sort of banking on the fact that the reader is going to want this villain to pay the price. Right. And now my creative thoughts are flowing thinking about a story like that, because, for anybody who knows anything about my first book, Between Two Minds, Awakening it goes back and forth between two character perspectives. Or are they two characters? That's part of the question, right? And you're in one vastly different place in different scenes, and you're rooting for one. You don't know if you're rooting for another, and creating that instability and how do these even resolve? And I wrote, it's called an interleave narrative. Like, I didn't know I was writing that, but apparently that's what it's called. And playing with the idea of, and some people, this is their pet peeve, and I've gotten reviews. I didn't know what was going on in this chapter. It doesn't follow chronologically. I didn't have enough cues. And I think a lot of that is important, feedback for authors. But I think a lot of what I try to do is challenge my readers. Going back to short stories, I think to some extent, short stories are a challenge to the readers because they know going in, like, this is a short-term investment, like, why, I guess, what's the compelling argument to read a short story as opposed to getting more invested into a novel?
A big reason is time. So there are people who really enjoy reading, but they find that they don't have a lot of time. And therefore, if you write, especially like an anthology or a collection of short stories, you have like breaks in between. So you're invested in a short-term investment. So you can read one story while you're waiting at a doctor's office or whatever, rather than, a long chapter or what have you.
And I guess in today's, micro content, world that we live in, where, 8-second videos are kind of the norm, short stories probably have a pretty good niche that they can fill in that scenario. So very interesting stuff, Clarence. I appreciate you coming on and talking about it. Why don't you go ahead and pitch your latest book again?
I have it right here. It's called Shadows and Keyholes, a collection of short stories. There are 10 short stories. They explore the darker side of life, death, and whatever comes after.
Very cool. Thanks again. Appreciate everybody watching until this point, and I will catch you all next time.